Hey Joe, we're here. Last time we were talking, it was really the dog days of summer being here in Charlotte with high 90s and humidity that would fogs up your windows. We've had a couple of rainstorms that's kind of cooled off here, but school's now in session. So how would you get ready for school these days, right?
Well, people getting ready for school really don't have to go anywhere here in the region because they're all doing it from home. The big challenges I've had since we last talked, it's cooling off into the 60s at night, and so my really big problem is the pool is too cold for me to get in now. Only 81 instead of 88, so my wife thinks I'm a wimp for not jumping in, but
I hope your Minnesota friends up north in Wisconsin aren't listening to this. They will, you're going to get some emails and some text messages, I'm sure. So,
deservedly so. Deservedly so. Yeah, it's been busy. I've been doing a fair amount of consulting, and I'm always amazed, Mike. What opportunities come your way, and it's been fun. Enjoyed it a lot. I'm actually working. Um, Before my retirement, I'm working about the same amount of time, so it's been good. I've enjoyed it.
during a pandemic, congratulations. That's
Yeah,
great. So,
yeah. Good
well, in
times.
regards to the podcast, I think we've got one of your ringers on the hook today. I know we've been trying to get this gentleman on the docket, and for selfish reasons, sounds like he's in good company. He's been following you with your Blue Yeti, so they should maybe sponsor us in the future. But who do we have on board for today's podcast?
Well, I'm thrilled to have Kevin Farner with us today. Kevin and I go back over 20 years. So we were just doing the math. I think, Kevin, we said 24 years. Kevin and I worked together back when we both worked for what is now FIS. It went through several different name changes and acquisitions, but we spent a lot of time there building banking software back in the day. That's when I got to know Kevin. And then he and I both worked for the Bank of New York, a division of the bank. So I recruited him to do it again at the Bank of New York, and he ran our PMO and ran product for the whole company. He created a web-based platform, the first of its kind in our industry. Pretty innovative stuff. I remember Compass. That was a blast. And then I left the Bank of New York and joined what is now called RSM, McGladdery. Well, it used to be McGladdery, now it's RSM. They've dropped the name. I don't know. Maybe they pay by the letter. They needed to save some cash. But Kevin joined me there as well in Minneapolis. We made the move from the Bank of New York to Minneapolis. So it was Milwaukee to Minneapolis. And so he spent some time there. And I'll never forget one of the cool things we did. Kevin, I'll tell this story to kind of kick things off. But we had an opportunity to kind of reinvent the company at the time. And Kevin had this idea. We got this from the city of Detroit, but it was RSM 2.0, let's call it. And Kevin found this great example of a way to kind of pitch your strategy. And I've used the same concept multiple times, where you tell stories that are set into the future. You also tell stories that are set in the current situation, where they highlight the current problems. And I think Kevin was flying back from a business trip, maybe visiting one of our branch offices, and he found a company called Explain. And we were challenged with trying to figure out how to create a simplified message to go to our executive team to say, here's the challenge we're seeing, here's some solutions, and here's what tomorrow might look like if you were willing to make the investment. Do you remember, Kevin, that whole scenario?
I do, and thanks for having me on the show. In fact, so I just was going through my desk the other day doing some cleaning, and I found the placemat that drawing that we did, and it was fantastic. Yeah, so we did two things, like you said. The thing we got from the state of Michigan was the what if statements, and so we wrote, in certain ways, it was the Jerry Maguire manifesto type thing, where it was like, what if we could be what we wanted to be, and we talked about it in terms of for the employees, and from that document, which I want to say was what, Joe, 10 to 20 pages, something like that. we turned that into a one sheet with, obviously with the great help of X-Plane. They were amazing. Turning it into essentially a visualization of how we could make it better. And so we had a drawing of a building falling apart with old things, people coming into that building and then coming out and going into a new building. And we talked about what the solutions and what that future could look like.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I remember very distinctly, you had done a ton of field research, kind of one of the key principles of user experience design. And by the way, Mike had to leave us for a family situation. Not an emergency, Mike's okay, but we gave him permission to vacate. So Kevin and I are just going to carry on here. But I remember we took quotes from the field and we put them on a wall in a conference room, and we had the executives parade through. And then I think you had that placemat. We turned it into a very large poster and put it on the back wall. And then we had sort of new technology devices in the conference room for the executives to come and experience. And it was really neat to see their reaction. I remember some of the quotes. People would say, "There it is. There it is. Love it." Yeah. Yeah. So on the left-hand side, you can see the building that Kevin was just showing was not aligned and pieces falling off. The middle, we had a vision, a roadmap of where we wanted to take the investment strategy. On the right side, which was bright and cheery, was the Nirvana stage. And so we walked the execs through there. And I remember one of the execs was challenging us because they couldn't believe the quotes that we got from employees about the technology that they had at their disposal. Do you recall some of that?
Yeah, definitely. And, that's a great point. We took that entire room, we took over an entire room, and like you said, we did pull quotes. We had them hanging from the ceiling and around the wall. And one of the things that, as we talked with Explain about, is they said, you can't just show the problems of today and the solutions of tomorrow. You have to be able to articulate how you're going to get there. And so we had that sort of bridge of what was our renovation period. And one of the things we did in the conference room is a lot of the tools that the tax and audit folks had to use were just really poor. And there were a lot of just hacks that they had to use. And so we set up a table for like, this is what it's like when our auditors go to a company and have to get, shoved into some small conference room. And these are the tools that they use. And we showed that. And then we showed, another side again of what we could do with some technology. Yeah, it was great. And we were able to, like you said, if they challenged us, we were able to say, like, not only, yes, are these accurate, but like we've tamed it down.
Do you remember there was one quote, something about a dairy? I had better technology at the dairy farm or something along those lines than I do here.
Yeah, and I think one of them, I think the one that was also tough, but we thought it was important to show, was they said that they didn't trust that management would do anything about this. And we wanted them to know that, even though, again, to some extent, we were putting our own necks on the line by saying that. But by doing that, we wanted them to know that we couldn't commit to this and then not do it, because that would erode the feelings even more. And so we either had to do it or we had to stop telling people that we were going to do it.
Yeah, that's a good point. And the good news is they did fund it, and it was a fairly easy decision. And people's fears about management not listening were unfounded, because it was a no-brainer. And fortunately for us, we were able to make the kind of improvements that help that organization thrive. And I know they're doing very well to this day. It was a lot of fun. I think you said it, but I think one of the biggest lessons I learned is, if you're trying to convince the management team that they should spend money, if you can make them feel the pain that employees and customers are feeling, you'll have a higher probability of actually getting to a yes answer, which was pretty amazing.
Yeah, I remember you used to call that get them to say uncle. And we got to a certain point where the people we were presenting to said, okay, if you don't have to show us anymore. And I that is important. Like it can't be some nebulous sort of thing that you can't really touch. We had to make them feel it, and it's a good reminder. I will say that like even just now talking about it, I'm realizing that there's some things that I could be doing on a gig I'm on right now in terms of trying to convince some folks that there's some things that we should be doing that I could be doing in a way that's a little closer to this.
Yeah, it's really a powerful tool, and I was able to use the same sort of principles at most every company that I worked at since leaving RSM. Just so much fun, and I think there are a lot of parallels to that experience where you're out doing field research, you're learning from employees and customers firsthand. I think that's the big lesson that I think you've really embraced in your career. I remember when we were at the Bank of New York, you did something very similar. You went out and visited broker dealers, and they were our customers. We were a clearing and settlement operation for the bank in that division, and you led that whole effort where you were trying to discover, kind of the key requirements, and some pretty interesting stories out in the field about what brokers had on their screens and how they try to hide that data. Do you remember some of those stories?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the interesting things related to that was that they loved feeling like what they were using was complex, and so there was an interesting aspect within the institutional brokers and some of these other brokers, which was we needed to simplify things in ways that made their jobs easier to do, but we couldn't simplify it in ways that maybe for other professions and other things might seem normal. Like, hey, we need to get rid of some of the data density. Like they liked having a lot of information available to them all at once, and didn't mind a lot of that. And so there were workflow things we had to do, but not, again, we had to understand the context. Similarly, one of the things that we had to realize as we worked on things was how intense the 15 minutes before the market opened to an hour after market open was, and what they needed to do during that time period versus what they needed to do during other parts of the day. And that's a context issue. And it comes up in anything that you do where you have to be able to understand the environment, and you can't just do that via an interview. Now, in today's, right, like I feel like I have to have almost like the equivalent of a swear jar anytime I say like in today's environment or when you hear the commercials now more than ever. But in the current situation that we're in, as a practitioner, from a usability standpoint, and wanting to go out in the field, like there are still things that you can do today that are more than just interviewing people. And so it's an interesting sort of bridge between, what we were doing back then and what you can do today in terms of sort of a remote field study that's still more than just an interview. Because the issue with doing just an interview is if you were interviewing me right now about what I did today, I would get a ton of it wrong. I just wouldn't remember at the detail level that matters in terms of improving workflow. And so a lot of it is, observing people while they're doing their work, as opposed to just asking people how they do their work.
Yeah, that is a really interesting observation. I think so often, you talk to organizations that really haven't embraced the idea around user experience, and they don't spend much time at all, and they wonder why their products don't resonate. And it's surprising to me that after all these years, and as long as user experience mindsets have been around, the tool sets and the skill sets have been around, it's still not as widely practiced as you'd think it is. And what are you finding on that in that area?
It's an interesting mix because one of the things, so I work for a consulting company. I work for Gomoll Research and Design. We're a small user research and design firm in the Midwest, but we have local, national, and international clients. One of the things that we see is that there has been more embracing of this in some areas where you see, I think of, well, I'm in Minneapolis. I'll use Target as an example. Target has really grown their sort of full-time employee base of user experience professionals quite a bit in the last, say, 10 years. And there's several companies that have embraced that and brought it into full-time. But 100%, Joe, there are a lot of companies, big and small, that either give it lip service or believe in it and think that they're doing it correctly, but it's almost more like they're really focused on requirements. So they think of it more as a documentation exercise, or in terms of like, well, we need to make sure that we have those people, and those people, I just mean if they're making products for employees or if it's products for customers, they want to have that voice, but it's not the same thing as user experience. And that's right. That's that critical sort of step, is this idea of it's not just getting feedback, it's actually sort of understanding and observing. And that's where you can get the rich data, and not just rich sort of analytical, how do we improve somebody's workflow, but also understanding what are these needs that these people have. And that can include the emotional needs. What is driving this customer or this employee, and how do we get at that as well?
Has your business seen any sort of fluctuations with COVID-19? I know you've talked about some companies recognizing that they've got to respond with digital experiences. My favorite thing is to talk about digital transformation, and when most people hear that phrase, they either fall asleep because they're bored by hearing it again. But I like to think of it as getting the C-suite to transform how they think about leveraging technology in their businesses. What has been your experience thus far with COVID?
So, great question. I think that, so in general, one of the things that I'll say is we've noticed as a consulting company, we have a tendency to lag the market a little bit. So, for instance, back in the Great Recession of 2008, that didn't really, I mean, we escaped that pretty much unscathed, but the dip that we did see was maybe a year or two later. We haven't seen too much right now from us. One of the things that we're seeing is that there's a need from some of our clients for expertise in folks that know how to do a remote field study, a remote usability study, in the healthcare world, remote validation studies. And so that need has actually gone up, because that isn't, if you have a lot of junior people, that's not something that's super easy to do. And so if you have that experience in doing remote field studies and remote usability studies, that is certainly a need that exists today, obviously. I think the other thing, and I haven't seen a lot of it yet, but I think that, unless things are going to go back to quote unquote normal in the next 3 months, which I don't think there's any data that says that that's going to happen.
I don't think that's going to happen.
I think one of the things that is that there's going to be a need for is companies saying, how do we improve the internal experience? There's already been a number of studies done on what people refer to as Zoom fatigue. And this idea of now remote work is no longer a concept. And in fact, I think there's been companies that are realizing that this doesn't have to be a temporary thing, and it could be a good thing. I think, if you look out at Silicon Valley as leading indicators, several of the larger companies have said, we're going to allow people to work remotely indefinitely, and we're not going to force them to come back when this is over. And so there's going to be a need for companies that aren't sort of Silicon Valley companies and lead with digital products to look at, how do our employees do work, and how does doing it remotely, what tools do we need to use in order to make that efficient? And some of that, again, from a somebody who's a user experience designer, is understanding how employees do their work and what are we trying to accomplish. And from that, you're going to see these, what prior to this pandemic were potentially buzzwords that are real. Like, what are digital collaboration tools? What does it mean to be able to do that? I will tell you, like, the thing that is really hard is this idea of like, how do you do remote design collaboration in real time, and using things like, there's a product called Miro, Miro, using things where everybody can see somebody else drawing and can also take control and do drawing at the same time. When you're trying to come up with design solutions, things like that are really important. Using tools like InVision or Zeppelin, where you can post design, online, and people can comment on those things like that. Remote chat, like I mean, even whether it's Slack or Microsoft Teams, things where people can have that sort of asynchronous message threads are really, really important. One thing that's been great, I know I'm sort of rambling here, but it's a couple things that are coming to mind. I've actually seen my email go down in the last several months because with people remote, they have embraced these other tools that when they were in the office, they weren't embracing. And so whether it's Slack or Teams or these other online tools, they're almost forced to do it now. And so email goes down. And I think that's a good thing, right? So email has a time and a place, but it was being used for everything. And I think one of the things that I'm seeing now is that it's being used more judiciously. And you have these other modes of communication that essentially people were forced to use, that they're now slotting in saying, oh yeah, this actually does work.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I've actually witnessed that myself, I have both Slack and Teams, and I have, customers on both. And there's good and bad with it too, because you're accessible no matter what device you have. If you turn off your laptop, and you forget to, tell Slack you're not taking messages, you'll get pinged on your phone all day long. It's fascinating. As I also know, a couple of thoughts that I have on that, Kevin, is there are a couple of companies here in our region that have announced headquarter moves to Charlotte, and they're building these very large buildings. And I keep wondering, I wonder if they had rescoped the size of those buildings, given how successful COVID-19 has driven us to being, able to work successfully from home. So I wonder about that. And then, how do people, to your point about how do people work, how do you make sure that you're not invading their home space 24/7? I think that's another issue we're going to have to grapple with.
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to hear some futurists talk about some of this. But one of the things that I think it was REI just came out and said is that they are getting rid of their corporate headquarters, and there's some other companies as well. And I read a report just yesterday that like rent in San Francisco has gone down double digits because folks are literally moving out of the city now. So it is an interesting thing about what is the future of massive headquarters. What is the future of, and there's an interesting part about it too, when you think about it from a pandemic standpoint. On the one hand, you say, well, if fewer people are going to be going into work, you could get a smaller building and just have more of a hoteling concept where I don't actually have a desk. It's just a desk that anybody can use. But then you also have this idea of, well, yeah, it's also a pandemic with social distancing, and I don't necessarily want to use a desk that somebody else used. So I'm not sure where that happy medium is, but I do think that there's a future that is going to see a much larger percentage than we would have guessed back in February of people that are going to stay remote. And of course, there's going to be some people. There's people that I work with on a project that I'm on that can't wait to get back into the office because of their home life. And back to what you were talking about there, that again, coming back to it from my practitioner standpoint, there's a user experience element to what is it like for different people to have to work from home, right? There are people that I'm on a project with that have, 1-year-old babies that they have to contend with, and both spouses work. That means that in some meetings, um, one of them has to be holding a child while they're on a call. It means that from a calendar perspective, sometimes people are blocking out time. They're still working, but they can't take meetings because of the home commitments they have. And again, to your point, Teams, Slack, these other tools are available. I mean, and this has been true for email forever on your mobile device since smartphones, but
Right.
I think it's exacerbated now. How do you deal with that work-life balance? Um, and I think if anything, this has forced the issue more. I think one of the things, I'm not positive, but I think one of the things that's going to happen is that some of that balance is not going to be purely, okay, I'm working from 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. And at 5 p.m., I'm hanging my out of the office everywhere, and now it's my personal life. I think it's going to be a little more of the, you know what, at 9 a.m. I have to do this thing for a half hour. That's a personal thing. And from 1 to 2 p.m., I got to do a thing with my kids because they have to get online for school. Um, and so I think that work-life balance isn't purely going to be 8 hours work, 8 hours home, 8 hours sleep. And it's going to be that, hey, sometimes when I'm working, I have to step away and do some personal things. And maybe that also means that sometimes during personal time, I'm going to have to do some work things. Um, but trying to figure out how to manage that emotionally is a very interesting thing that I think companies need to pay attention to, not only individuals.
I think that's a really good point, Kevin. I think because I'll say a typical day has a beginning and an end pre-COVID. Now, last night I sent an email at 8:30 last night because I needed to follow up on an issue that popped up earlier in the day at one of the customers that I'm working with, and just felt like I needed to get that message out at that moment. And I think that blurring of the line will definitely be an experiment that we'll have to live through. I do think that at some point, though, I think we're kind of at an extreme end where I think some high percent of people are working from home, at least part-time, 70% of a number that I recall. And I think at some point down the road, I don't know if it's a year or 2 years from now, I think, some company's going to come along and I think I might have mentioned this to Mike in the past, that their innovation, their secret sauce is, hey, they meet together. They're actually huddling in a physical space and creating, and that might be their secret advantage because everyone else is working remotely. I can imagine a world where that might happen. But it reminds me, Kevin, of you and I were at a presentation while we were at the Bank of New York. We were in Washington D.C. and an economist was up speaking, and he said,
Are you
"Do you
about to say
remember?"
the markets are brutally efficient?
That's right. He said that. And to me, this period reminds me of that. The market is brutally efficient, and the creative energy that I see with some solutions like that. I was on um, a not-for-profit event here in the Charlotte region recently, where they had many hundreds of people on, and they had a segment of the experience where they did the normal, presentation mode and regurgitating or whatever. And then at the end, they had a networking section where you saw sort of crowds of people gathering in little bubbles on the screen. And you could pull yourself into that bubble, just like you were walking from one side of a room to another. And you could jump in and say, hey guys, how you doing? And then chat and then leave that bubble and go to another one. So it kind of felt a little bit like you were physically there. It was kind of a neat experience. I think I forget the name of it, but if I remember the name, I'll put it in the link on the YouTube because that was pretty innovative, I thought.
Yeah, that's great. And I do think the, so like I want to hesitate a moment and just say, like, it's such a horrible time for so many companies that I, you know, for companies that haven't done well during this, it's just brutal. Like restaurants, for example, like it's just, God, what a god awful time. So
Right.
having said that, like there's a restaurant here in the Twin Cities called Grand Cafe, and the innovation that they've done. So they closed down like all the restaurants did back in March, and they opened up in April, and they experimented with some daily distribution, and then they took a step back, and partially it was for employee safety. They wanted to limit the contact that employees were having with customers on a daily basis, but also I found it innovative. They ended up doing these weekly meal kits, and so you could show up on Friday or Saturday, and it's something like they had like 3 breakfasts, let's say 2 lunches, and 4 dinners. 2 of the dinners were like the individual pieces and you had to make it, and 2 of them were just sort of a heat up at home. But then not only were they doing that, they were teaming up with other local businesses. So they were also improving the community. And if you bought a meal kit, you were also you were getting a book, and they had like some paints so you could do an art project, and you had some flowers. And so, here are other local establishments that got to be part of these kits that they were doing. I mean, never mind that the food was incredible. The chef is a James Beard Award winner, but I just found it incredibly innovative in that I didn't see anybody else doing this when they launched. And they were selling out every week. And I just thought it was really fascinating. And, whatever, pick your industry. There is this idea of taking the situation that you're in and really looking at it and saying, what can we do with this? I'm not saying obviously that they were doing better than if it was just normal times, but you take the environment that you're in and say, okay, how do we do the best that we can do with this? And there are ways to try and innovate. And again, let's put my user experience hat on. Part of what they did is they said, okay, there's an issue here of contact and safety. If we put on the constraint of how do we minimize contact and increase safety, what does that mean? And what it meant for them was, what if we package multiple meals and only distribute them twice a week? That's an interesting way to think about things, right? Embrace the constraints.
Yeah, I love it. And, I think there's this notion that, in a world that's constantly changing, your ability to, flex and change and embrace that change is a big success factor. And the word that comes to mind is resilience. You're going to get obstacles thrown at you no matter what you embark on. And we certainly have with COVID-19. And it's really interesting to see companies that are not allowing that roadblock to be, a burden to such an extent that it takes them down a bad path. I have seen, unfortunately, in the food services industry, especially in the hotel industry, that they've been hit incredibly hard. One of my favorite restaurants in the Minneapolis area is Ciao Bella, and they had a sister restaurant, which I know they're not affiliated formally, but they adopted similar menus called Vivo. And Vivo actually had to close their doors a month or 2 back, which I actually shed a tear over that, Kevin. I always like to go back there when I'm in town, but I still go back to Ciao Bella when I was there. I was there in February and we went to Ciao Bella. We just made a quick in and out just at the beginning of COVID because, I was starting to see the facts. My wife and I talked about it. My mom is going to be 97 next week, and I wanted to get up there before all hell broke loose. So we were able to get up there and back in a very short period of time. We drove actually to avoid airports and everything else.
Sure. Yeah.
But it was just, I've just had so much fun catching up. I mean, love to hear any other thoughts or stories you might have related to your own experience with user experience. You've been at Gomoll Research. Obviously, I know Kate and Tom very well. And those guys have been inspirational to me. In fact, in my first book, which I'm working on a second one, Kevin, that I told that story that Tom shared with Apple and the video of the guy opening the box, the computer box, and pulling out a stack of paper, and Read Me First was like halfway down the stack, and that's the video they used with John Scully, who was the CEO at Apple at the time, to convince him that they needed to spend money on usability. And that's how Tom got that across the finish line. So, it occurred to me that that story we told at the very beginning of the podcast about pain, if you share the pain, then you'll get the yes answer. That's exactly what Tom did there. Fascinating. There's a couple other phrases, the catchphrases. Let's see if you can remember one of them. What am I thinking, Kevin?
Sure. So one of the ones that I use to this day, in terms of trying to get people to, approve a project or a thing that you want to do, is don't sell past the close. So that was one that you taught me in terms of, I think it started from your dad when he was selling carpeting.
That's right.
He taught you that. And I think you taught me that at the Bank of New York, presenting to the president of the Bank of New York, that you were mid-sentence and he said yes, and you just shut your mouth, said thank you, threw your files in your briefcase and walked out of the room.
That's a true story.
And I've used that with people that I work with. They say, if they don't sell past the close, somebody says yes, you don't need to convince them anymore.
Yep, that was my dad that taught me that. I was selling carpet and the customer, the family said yes, and I just kept selling. And my dad waved me into the office and said, they said yes. Stop selling.
But one of the things from what we're working on, one of the things that's really interesting right now. So we Gomoll are doing work at various companies, but some med device work. And one of the things that's very interesting is with the pandemic, there's an increase in the need for how do you share, healthcare and med device data or the healthcare experience in a world where the patients shouldn't be coming into a hospital or a clinic. There's just massive opportunities there. Again, if you try to say and I am not, I will confess from a emotional mental health perspective, I have not spent the past 4 months saying what good is going to come of this. But if I do look at it from a industry, big picture, what are some things that this type of sort of major sort of shifting event could do that could be improvements, right? I think the whole idea of telehealth, which people have been talking about, I want to say since 2011 or 2012. I remember going to a conference at Mayo and hearing some stuff about that. And the tools have been around for quite a while to be able to do it, but there just hasn't been an appetite. And sometimes it's as simple as, we don't have the insurance codes to be able to bill for telehealth, right? Sometimes it's the ugly minutia of things that make some of these things hard to move. But if the idea of telehealth and doing things from a hospital or clinic app to a patient app can stop people that are at risk from having to go into a hospital or a clinic, that is massive. That can be industry altering. And we're involved in some small pieces of that. And I love it. I think that it's one of those times where it can improve the lives of the people at the hospitals and clinics. It can improve the lives of the patients. And again, it really falls into the wheelhouse of understanding what's the workflow, what's the experience, what are the emotional needs that these people have.
Yeah, you step from traditional business into something more mission-based, where you're really putting your heart into something. And that's a pretty cool experience when you can make that happen. I don't know, we're coming up on the top of the hour. I do remember one story about your kids when I convinced you to move from Milwaukee to Minneapolis to take the job at RSM. And Ruthie, your youngest, you were coming across the border into Minnesota, and she said, "Hey, it looks the same as Wisconsin." So I think your kids don't fall far from the tree because your daughter was very, her powers of observation were amazing. just like you, Kevin.
Yeah, now she's realized though that there are some differences. So she being the youngest, she's absorbed more of the Minnesota stuff, and so she's the rest of the world says duck duck goose, and she now says duck duck gray duck, which
Yeah.
is a Minnesota thing.
Yeah, I thought they were pulling my leg when I first heard that. When I got to Minnesota, what are you saying? And then your two sons, how are they doing?
Good. So my oldest, Will, is at Drexel University in Philadelphia, pursuing his PhD in astrophysics. So he's really slumming it.
Yeah.
James he's getting his master's at the new school in Manhattan. The reason that I paused there and said is that physically he's actually downstairs. So he and his girlfriend have an apartment in Manhattan. And when things got really bad in March, they went to Dallas and spent some time at her parents' place, several months. And now they're spending a couple weeks here with us. And then they're going to head back to New York. But his final year is, at least this next semester, is going to be online, which I'm glad about.
So many New Yorkers. I have a brother who's got a daughter that lives there with her husband and kids. And they're actually living with them in a southern state right now. But it's interesting how many vacant apartments there are in New York. You can probably pick one up for relatively cheap. I guess relative is the proper word there, because even though it might be cheaper than normal, it's still pretty expensive. Right. I would imagine.
Yeah, and it's incredibly privileged to be able to do that, and he knows that. But yeah, it was very fortunate to be able to get out at the time that it was bad, and we had a little chuckle because he went down to Dallas, and obviously Texas over the last 2 months has flared up, and New York is now looking a lot better.
Exactly. It's paradise. Well, Kevin, thank you so much. And give my best regards to the family and Jen. Any last minute thoughts or comments before we close out for the day?
So the plug would be, if anybody is looking to do user experience stuff, GomollDesign.com, GOMOLL design.com. But I think the thoughts that I have for your audience, that I assume are folks like yourself, is to really, during these times, think about what is the experience, how has that changed for your employees and for your customers, and then how can you go about learning more about that in a remote world. There are opportunities to be gained right now, because some of this stuff is not going to go back. Even if we have a miracle cure and a vaccine that is totally effective, and cross your fingers that the majority of people actually get, there's some of this isn't going to go back. And so if you think about it that way, now is the time to go after that and say, how do we learn about what those opportunities are?
That's great advice and insight. And I would encourage everyone to do that. And I'll put a plug in for Gomoll Research. You guys have helped me and the companies I've worked for tremendously throughout my career. It's influenced me, what I've learned from you, Kevin, and from Kate and Tom both. And I think at some point down the road here a bit, it would be fun to have all three of you on for a lively conversation. So we'll tee that up down the road. But thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast. Love the stories, and I'm sure we could talk for another hour. I'm not sure if we'd have listeners after that hour, but
this has been great. Thank you. This has really been wonderful. I really appreciate it, and it was a lot of fun.
You bet. And have a great evening, and best to the family.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.